Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Stephanie Jones, and I'm delighted to welcome you all back to the third lecture of this exciting series given by Professor Betty St.Pierre. As we gather in Athens, Georgia, in the United States, on the eve of one of the most historic elections in this country's relatively short history as a nation state, I want to begin by acknowledging the power and importance of place, land, and labor. The University of Georgia is located on the traditional ancestral territory of Muskogee-speaking and Cherokee peoples, as well as other Native communities who were forcibly removed from their homelands. The lands occupied by the university throughout the state were places of lived relationships, learning, ceremony, and resistance. We recognize these Native peoples as the original caretakers who continue to pass on their histories and traditions, sustaining connections to their ancestral lands and water. We are able to be here today due in part to the labor of enslaved people of African descent who helped build this university, and the ongoing daily labor of many people for whom students and even faculty sometimes rarely see. I want to acknowledge some of you who have worked directly on this series, including Jeff Reeder and Michael Weisenbaker, our audiovisual and technology experts. Without them, this would not happen. And graduate students Flor, Sunja, Lee, Melissa, Lindsay, Amos, Maria, Vanessa, Reed, and Jay, who not only work hard for this series, but also inspire us on a regular basis. I see applause coming from them. My UGA colleagues, Melissa Freeman, Program Coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Studies Program, and Hillary Hughes and I work alongside colleagues from other institutions, including Sophia Jung from the Ohio State University, Corey Johnson from North Carolina State University, Marty Schmeichel from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, Karen Spector from the University of Alabama, and Jessica Van Cleve from Gardner-Webb University. And all of this wonderful team makes this series possible. So thank you. And of course, as most of you know, we have Professor Martin Camaret here today from the University of Ottawa, who will join Betty on stage for some casual back porch conversations following the lecture. We welcome Martin and his two doctoral students as well. The series is supported by the UGA Institute for Women's Studies, the UGA Graduate School, Mary Frances Early College of Education, the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Studies Program, the Red Clay Writing Project, as well as the University of Alabama, North Carolina State University, and the Ohio State University. Thank you, everyone. And I want to thank and acknowledge each of you who are joining us in person and via Zoom webinar. We are joining in from many different time zones, in the middle of the night, early in the morning, during the middle of the day, and everywhere in between. We are, all of us, experiencing many variations of the Earth's rotation in relation to the sun, the moon, and other celestial bodies right now. Can you please, if you're in this room, if you're affiliated with UGA, just put your hand up. We're going to do a little yay. We're so glad that our UGA folks are here. And folks from another institution, just give us a thank you. We love having people come in from outside of UGA as well. It is truly remarkable that so many of you, so many of us keep showing up. Many people have contacted me to share how much fun they're having with this series. They love attending the lectures and the workshops in person and via Zoom. Some of you have used the word joy to describe the experience with the lecture series. Others use the word exciting, community. We are bringing something new into existence. Indeed, like Betty wrote in her paper for this lecture, titled Post Qualitative Inquiry in an Ontology of Immanence, in an ontology of immanence, one becomes less interested in what is and more interested in what might be and what is coming into being. Post-qualitative inquiry resists capture. It is emergent, new, different, speculative, and what my colleague James F. Woglam and I call mutant. And now a lesson in experimentation, speculation, mutation, and newness. This coming together in community and in solidarity around the power and importance of creating newness and difference inside and outside the academy is a small thing, a small convergence, collision, and intensity that has already had and will continue to have resonances far beyond what we can perceive. Erin Yu June McMorrow writes in her book, Grounded, a fierce feminine guide to connecting with the soil from the ground up, that academia has been patriarchal from its onset, and its manner of controlling the conversation about research, as well as who gains access to participate, has particular consequences for all of us. The fear of feminine intuition, nonlinear thought, and embodied knowing has been alive and well in academia. Betty argues that post-qualitative inquiry is not a project of patriarchal, colonial, humanist, positivist epistemology that is linked to a two-world ontology, a world of separation and separability. She invites us to dip our toes into a one-world ontology, a world where everything that is sensible and beyond is interconnected. Many scholars across many disciplines have always inquired this way. Take, for example, Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who I learned through a doctoral student of mine. This is a scholar of indigenous science who writes about her home of El Salvador and knowing that the land carries trauma. She writes, "This is why it is up to my generation to start our healing journey as war trauma lurks within us every day. Like banana trees, we must grow new banana leaves and continue to build a new chapter in our lives to ensure we can heal as displaced indigenous peoples who had to also endure a war and genocide against our people." Suzanne Simard, scholar in forestry sciences, also listens to the land. Indeed, as a young graduate student in her 20s, she intuited that the trees and other plants in the forest were not competing against each other for resources, as was the dominant view in the field of forestry since the beginning of that discipline. But she believed that they were in community with one another, nurturing one another, communicating with one another, following those hunches, being led by her entanglement with the forest. She upended the entire field. And as a result of her decades-long inquiry, it is now widely believed that the forest is a relational field of communication and nurturing, with generations of information being passed along through hubs called mother trees. Schooling, at least conventional schooling, through higher education, including the teaching of researchers, has long ignored the body, movement, spirit, earthkin, the elements, energy, intuition, dreams, imagination, joy, desire, connection. Instead, it opts for a system that claims to know, a system of repetition and predictability, documentation and surveillance, a system intensified by decades of neoliberalism. There are few American scholars or individual academic programs that profoundly shift the landscape of what becomes taught in mainstream higher education. Milton Friedman, that name might be familiar, the grandfather of neoliberal capitalist economic policies, and his academic program at the University of Chicago is one that comes to mind. He taught at Chicago for 30 years, from 1947 to 1977, And those generations of students and people with whom he collaborated, often called the Chicago Boys, scattered out to every corner of the United States and across the globe as economists, academics, politicians, private industry leaders, and more. Neoliberalism didn't begin to take hold in political circles and academic departments until the late 1970s. That was near the end of Milton Friedman's career. But its grip has tightened since the 1980s, continued to intensify in the 2000s, and it has become so dominant a discourse in higher education that it's difficult to find departments in higher education, especially in economics or business, that teach anything else. And we might also argue departments of colleges of education, excuse me. Indeed, it is so dominant in politics that there is no distinction between the major political parties in the United States and many other countries as well when it comes to a commitment to neoliberal capitalism. We are in the presence of and entangled here today with a legacy of a 47-year-old program. It's an academic program and a scholar who is having a similar kind of reverberation, although let's hope a much more positive and hopeful one. The Qualitative Studies program here at UGA was the first of its kind and deeply influenced by many women scholars who brought and continue to bring feminist thought, post-philosophies, and other perspectives to qualitative inquiry of all kinds. Part of that impact is a charge to unravel the certainties of a science that can produce something like neoliberalism. Sorry. And it's also a charge not to live within the confines passed down to us to simply repeat, but instead to create anew, dare to do, think, become, feel, move differently. Not to codify new structures of inquiry to be repeated by others, but to encourage openness and imagination, deep philosophical engagement, and what Martin called this morning philosophizing, that is responsive to the time, place, dreams, desire, power, and conditions within which we are entangled. If Milton Friedman had his Chicago boys out there changing the world, I think we have something along the lines of the Georgia feminists and folks out there making many waves and reverberations across the country and across the globe. These reverberations may not be intelligible to us now, or maybe never, but it does seem appropriate that this movement is emerging within and out of the US South, with many faculty over the years living here for decades and coming from across the Southeast, including parts of Appalachia. One of our bravest and boldest is Professor Elizabeth St.Pierre, so please help me welcome her to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I want to thank my truly exceptional friend and colleague, Dr. Stephanie Jones, and the also exceptional committees of faculty and students and technology experts whose careful work makes this lecture series possible. Today, I'm very excited to welcome a new colleague to the University of Georgia, Professor Martin Camere, whom I met not long ago, as well as two of his students. Dr. Camere is a professor in human kinetics at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Martin and I were recently invited to write articles for a special issue of the journal Qualitative Research in Psychology on the critical post-humanities and post-qualitative inquiry in psychology. We've been emailing since then, sharing articles to read and talking about how to teach post-qualitative inquiry. Thank you so much for coming to Georgia to help us think, Martin. I'm also happy to welcome two fellow North Carolinians who are UGA graduates doing outstanding work in their professorships and who are helping us with this lecture series from a distance, Dr. Jessica Van Cleve and from Gardner-Webb University, and Dr. Corey Johnson from NC State University. Thanks for coming. As you know, each of my lectures is linked to a paper I've written about post-qualitative inquiry, so I won't repeat the details of those papers in my lectures, but we'll discuss them as well as related topics more generally. First, let me tell you a bit about today's paper, Post Qualitative Inquiry in an Ontology of Immanence. The American Educational Research Association's Qualitative Research SIG or Special Interest Group invited me to present its annual GUBA lecture in 2017, and this journal article is based on that lecture. Each year, the journal Qualitative Inquiry publishes and so archives the GUBA lectures. It was an honor for me to present this lecture because Professor Egon Guba helped found and invent qualitative methodology, and his work has always guided my own. In 1985, he and Ivana Lincoln published one of the first books about qualitative methodology, Naturalistic Inquiry, which became a standard textbook for the field in which I've studied. In 1989, he and Dr. Lincoln published another classic textbook, Fourth Generation Evaluation. As a new doctoral student in 1991, I also studied his important book published in 1990, The Paradigm Dialogue. That book was my introduction to paradigms, which I later traced to Thomas Kuhn's 1962 book, The Structure of a Scientific Revolution. I count myself lucky to be part of Dr. Guba's academic lineage because one of my professors at Ohio State, Dr. Patty Lather, was Dr. Guba's student, and my students, of course, continue that lineage. I worked hard on my lecture and the subsequent paper, knowing it would be one of the published GUBA lectures, hoping it would honor both his and Patty Lather's energy, imagination, and rigor. With all that in mind, I want to repeat some key points about post-qualitative inquiry I made in the first two lectures before I move to the topics of today's lecture, ontology and immanence. First and most important is that post-qualitative inquiry begins with post-structuralism, its concepts, and its ontology of immanence. So you must study post-structuralism if you want to do post-qualitative inquiry, just as you have to study chemistry if you want to be a chemist. I believe it takes years of reading, a long preparation, to begin to understand the work of those scholars we now call post-structural, just as it takes years of study to understand any new body of knowledge like physics, horticulture, sociology, or rhetoric. Each field has invented its theories and its concepts, which aren't jargon. They're the language that organizes and differentiates the field, the language that must be learned. Philosophy is no different. Particular philosophies, theories, and concepts have normalized us and the world we live in now, the world we take for granted. We say, everybody knows this is just the way it is. But post-structuralism helps us understand there have been and are different descriptions which might enable different worlds and different lives. After all, philosophy is more about living than knowing. The first task, then, of someone who wants to understand post-qualitative inquiry is to study post-structuralism. Second, post-qual is not another pre-existing humanist empirical social science research methodology like those we often see strung together in a sentence, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, experimental, and so on. Nor is post-qual a version of qualitative methodology, which is often the default for approaches to inquiry that don't fit into existing categories. In other words, post-qual doesn't fit under what some have called qualitative methodology's big tent. Because post-qualitative inquiry is immanent, it cannot and does not exist prior to its arrival. It's always coming into existence. That means there can be no pre-existing research designs or methods in post-qual that tell you what to do and when to do it. For those of us who've been overtrained in methodology and expect instructions, not knowing what to do before we begin can be frustrating. Because post-qual cannot exist in advance, it cannot be taught or learned. What can be taught and learned is post-structuralism. What can be taught and learned are the history and politics of philosophical concepts that enable or do not enable methodology. Concepts like epistemology, rationalism, empiricism, ontology, and so on. Third, post-qualitative inquiry does not reject qualitative methodology. It's just something different altogether. How is it different? In my October 7 lecture that focused on empiricism, I explained that post-qual refuses the centuries-old Cartesian, rational, empirical, philosophy, science binaries that organize the epistemologies of pre-existing empirical humanist methodologies. In fact, post-structuralism has always been suspicious of the rationalisms and empiricisms of the epistemological project. For example, in 1992, Judith Butler wrote that the epistemological point of departure in philosophy is inadequate. Given that what counts as the empirical must align with one's philosophical approach, I explained that because post-structuralism refuses logical empiricism or logical positivism, as well as the empiricism of phenomenology, so does post-qual. Because Deleuze's transcendental empiricism does align with post-structuralism, it also aligns with post-qual. I also pointed out that in my dissertation research, I learned that the muddled empiricism of qualitative methodology, some strange combination of logical positivism and phenomenology, was completely inadequate in the face of the rich density of the empirical world, what the American philosopher William James called the big, blooming, buzzing confusion of reality, whatever that is. I found it impossible and absurd to try to limit my study to the empirical data I could collect using the empirical methods of qualitative methodology. What I learned at the very beginning of my academic career is that qualitative methodology was neither philosophical enough or empirical enough. Even then, it seemed to stand outside thought and privilege the repetition of unquestioned practices and techniques. I also explained that given the very fragile state of the world right now, a fragility many trace to man's incessant knowledge projects, not only sanctioned but championed by the scientific revolution of the 1600s and its new empiricism, a turn, a paradigm shift seems in order. Is our task now in the Anthropocene to continue epistemology's rage for knowledge? What else might we think about if not the next empirical research project and its findings that might, as a positivist command, fill another tiny gap in the shaky but omnivorous foundations of knowledge? I also want to say very clearly and even emphatically that I do not believe post-qualitative inquiry is a corrective, a fix, a cure, a better alternative. In my October lecture, I referred to the philosopher and historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, who explained that the new paradigm after a paradigm shift doesn't represent progress getting closer and closer to the truth of things. In fact, the new paradigm is typically so different that it's incommensurable with the prior paradigm and even unintelligible to those working in the earlier paradigm. Kuhn made what some might find a shocking ontological claim that scientists working in different paradigms work in different worlds. For example, the positivist and the post-structuralist work, think, and live in different incommensurable worlds because their ontologies are incommensurable ontologies. For that reason, the romance of talking across our differences fails when those worlds collide and bounce off each other. For example, you can't believe at the same time that the world is flat and that it's round, or at the same time that the world exists and that it's in continuous variation. I have certainly learned about incommensurability as I have tracked the reception of post-qualitative inquiry since my first publication about it in the 2011 Sage Handbook of Qualitative Inquiry. It's almost always treated as another pre-existing social science research methodology with its own research designs and methods. For example, in 2017, just 6 years after that first publication, the American Educational Research Association's Division D research methodology included post-qual in its list of approved methodologies in its call for papers for the next annual conference. Here's that list. Quantitative methods and statistical theory, qualitative, post-qualitative, and case-based methods, as well as critical, design-based, and participatory methods. Given the federal government's and AERA's privileging of scientifically based research and education, it's not surprising that measurement and psychometrics are first in the list. Perhaps you noted there's nothing in that list about philosophical inquiry. It's all empirical research. I was truly shocked when I saw post-qual in Division D's list of sanctioned methodologies, but I'm not anymore. Post-qual will be categorized as another pre-existing humanist empirical social science research methodology, no matter how many times I write and say it isn't. What is this urge to assimilate something different into the recognizable, to colonize and reduce difference to the same so we can understand it, consume it, and not have to think about it again? We may defend ourselves saying this is too hard or too different or too confusing, and then condemn it as elitist or exclusionary or unreasonable or worse, uncaring, because it's easier to denigrate and dismiss the too different than to let it be different, out of reach, inaccessible, unavailable to easy understanding and assimilation. Alleging elitism and exclusion in the face of difference is not uncommon, even in emancipatory work, which claims to valorize the other and protect difference from oppression, but may not. In other words, difference is celebrated as long as it's not too different. Post-colonial scholars have certainly learned that lesson. If it's too different, if it refuses our best intentions and is unwelcoming and uncooperative, if difference doesn't rush to meet our understanding, it becomes a problem. This is an old story that repeats itself, a habit that reflects the confusion and fear that can play out when we encounter difference that threatens what has been normalized and has become comfortable. I fear we social scientists have been so methodologized we can't think outside our habit of believing those pre-existing empirical methodologies are true and that individual studies must be assigned to a recognizable methodology container, whether they fit or not. I suppose I should not be surprised because the social sciences have never known what to do with post-structuralism. But the social sciences have convinced us that the study of the world requires a method, and an empirical method at that. When a social scientist says she's doing research, the first question is likely to be, what methodology are you using, and not what's happened or what are you interested in thinking about? I'm teaching a doctoral seminar on feminist research methodology right now, and am reminded, as I believe I said in my September lecture, that second wave feminists were leery of the entire empirical methodological project, which they saw as sexist, racist, colonial, homophobic, and so on. In 1973, the feminist Mary Daly identified methodolatry, the worship of method, which goes hand in hand with scientism, the worship of science. And the essence of scientism is methodology. If you remember in my October lecture, I quoted the post-colonial scholar Edward Said, who reminded us there's a strong connection between the philosophies of Locke and Hume, those Enlightenment British empiricists who set us on the path of today's empiricism, and their racial theories, justifications of slavery, arguments of colonial exploitation. To get themselves off the hook, those early empiricists shifted ethical responsibilities from themselves as knowers to procedural methods that, if followed properly, could guarantee unbiased, objective knowledge. Given all that, I would expect that we, especially those of us working for social justice, would be more suspicious of the entire empirical methodological project, and some are. But it seems to me that instead of refusing those methodologies, we just tweak them a bit here and there. We think we must provide an existing label for our research, lest it be unintelligible, unrecognizable. I think we have indeed been methodologized. Why is it so hard to refuse those pre-existing methodologies? After all, we made them up. We wrote them into existence. We invented them in language, in text, sentence by sentence. They are 20th century historical artifacts and are not real or sacrosanct or necessary. They're fictions, increasingly elaborate, regulative, convenient fictions. Why then do we continue to repeat them? I suspect it's because they are convenient. After all, we can teach someone methodology, what to do, but I'm not sure we can teach someone to think. I expect all of us here today are good students and we learn what we're taught. We let ourselves be trained and overtrained in methodology. Many doctoral students take more courses in research methodology than in the philosophies and theories in which those methodologies are thinkable. So methodology has become a standalone, taken for granted truth, mandatory, inevitable. Its epistemological and ontological commitments mostly invisible. It's so common, so expected, that it seems heretical to refuse it. In 2016, I wrote a paper arguing that we need to untrain educational researchers so we can think and live differently. Otherwise, as Leotard wrote, we become thoughtless functionaries in the maintenance crews for the big explanatory machines. My point here is that making space for difference often begins with refusal of an entrenched system of thought like methodology. We have to refuse the dogmatic, the taken for granted that traps us in order to clear some space for something different, something not prescribed in advance, something that might be surprising and even at odds with what we've been taught is true and necessary. Post qualitative inquiry is my contribution to that refusal and to the possibility of difference. As I've said, I work hard to keep post-qual unmethodologized, smooth, and not striated with orders and instructions, though others can't resist dropping it into that familiar category, methodology. I believe they have not studied post-structuralism and so do not understand its refusal of the onto-epistemological project that requires methodologies. They've been taught and so believe that thought needs a method to protect it from error. Method promises to cleanse social research of life's messiness, what the feminist scholar Joan Fujimura called the awkward surplus of our studies we ignore because we don't know what to do with it. Of course, methodologies are especially useful in defining, disciplining, and differentiating a field. Psychology relies on its methodologies to sustain its legitimacy, and they're likely different from the methodologies of geography and sociology and economics and political science. It's important that research in economics look like economics and not like psychology. Otherwise, economics might come undone. In 2000, Aronowitz and Osh wrote that the tendency toward privileging methodology is a symptom of the insecurity shared by most branches of the human sciences about the scientific status of their findings. The pretentious methodological systematicity that's supposed to make research and entire social science disciplines must not be tampered with. And moving out to a bigger picture, it's really important that science not look like philosophy or literature, even though, as John Law explained in his book, After Method, the practices of science are quite obsessively textual. Because what is observed by the scientist must be secured in language, in words, as James Clifford, the anthropologist, noted, Textualization is a prerequisite to interpretation. Knowledge is, to a great extent, textual staging. After Derrida, who wrote that meaning cannot be contained in language, one might wonder how words in a poem or a Platonic dialogue or a song written by Elton John differ from words in scientific field notes. Which words count as science? Who decides and how? This is really messy, isn't it? But we do use methodologies to discipline disciplines, and it's not unusual for someone to say, well, this study doesn't look like psychology or geography or political science. And what did she do anyway? What was her methodology? She might not get a job. Actually, that's the work I think we should be interested in, work that can't be gobbled up by methodology, signals an anomaly that might produce a turn, a paradigm shift, and a space for invention and something different. If you're interested in refusing our pre-existing empirical social science research methodologies, you have lots of allies, especially those scholars we now call post-structural. In my paper that was the focus of my first lecture in September, a primer for Post Qualitative Inquiry, I listed quotations by Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and others who refused a method. Beardsworth, for example, explained that Derrida refused the term method because a thinker with a method has already decided how to proceed and is unable to give him or herself up to the matter of thought in hand, is a functionary of the criteria which structure his or her conceptual gestures. I argue that the methodologist is almost always a functionary of the method. Let me give you an example. In my doctoral seminars, I often ask students to retrieve and analyze 8 to 10 journal articles on topics they're interested in to get a sense of the conversations going on in their own and in different disciplines. Several years ago, a first semester doctoral student who had not yet been methodologized wrote the following about one of the last articles she reviewed for the assignment. She wrote, I found that apart from the different research focus of the participants' fields, this article's research design and findings are not significantly different from previous studies, and the different fields did not have a particularly large impact on the results. I began to wonder why such similar studies are being conducted. I think that's a telling observation by a new doctoral student only 8 weeks into her program. But why would you expect to get different results if you follow the same process? A colleague on another continent told me some years ago that her college used to teach methodology but stopped because their student studies were too much alike. Given the purpose of methodology is to govern what can be done and what can be thought, why would we expect departures from the norm? Why would we expect what Deleuze and Guattari called something interesting, remarkable, or important? Something different instead of the repetition of the same. I believe methodology, which is inherently conservative, is a habit we need to break because it stifles experimentation from the outset. Aaron Manning wrote that it stops potential on its way. Again, the refusal of methodology, the deconstruction of its structure is not new. For decades, scholars have pressed on different concepts and practices in qualitative methodology and watched them stutter and shiver and just fly off. Felicia Jackson and Lisa Matsei, who will be here with us in January, deconstructed voice. Jim Sherrick deconstructed the interview and validity. Patty Lather deconstructed clarity, validity, authenticity, and empathy. Wanda Pillow deconstructed reflexivity. I've deconstructed data. Joan Scott, the feminist historian, deconstructed experience. The failure of so many of methodology's concepts and practices left it in ruins. And for years, we called our deconstructive efforts working the ruins. In 2011, Maggie McClure, who will be here with us in March, published a paper titled Qualitative Inquiry, Where Are the Ruins? Despite all our deconstructive work, She wondered how much damage had actually been done. Had we collapsed the system or merely produced a gloss on the same old Enlightenment edifice? Refusing methodology is risky and for some unthinkable, but Aaron Manning wrote that method is an apparatus of capture and argued that a leap must be made, and it is a leap that is undoubtedly disorienting. What emerges across this cleft cannot be mapped in advance, but thought must always leap. But when is someone ready to leap? When is a discipline ready to leap? For 30 years, I've watched generations of senior academics in positions of power shut down instead of support the next generation's desire to experiment and invent something different. We do this in the name of good sense and common sense, what Derrida called authoritarian dogmatism. And I'm increasingly concerned about the ethics of those disciplinary practices, especially now when we so desperately need fresh approaches to the problems our tired disciplines have created. In my October lecture about empiricism, I said I don't think we teach the history and politics of empiricism in our methodology courses, and I don't think we teach the history and politics of ontology either. We jump right to methodology, to the doing, to techniques, methods, and practices, as if they're not completely enabled by our epistemological and ontological commitments. I think we forget that methodologies are thinkable only in particular onto-epistemological arrangements. That's Karen Barad's concept, onto-epistemology, or in what Foucault calls systems of thought, or discursive formations which allow certain things and not others to be thought and done. And here I turn to Thomas Kuhn again to help us think about the relation of epistemology and ontology, of knowledge and being. On the last page of his book, The Structure of a Scientific Revolution, Kuhn asked a question I think I skipped right over the first 5 or 10 times I read it. What must the world be like in order that man may know it? Think about that. What must the world be like in order that man may know it? Well, if we want to know the world, if that's our project, and it's obviously an epistemological project, we must assume the world is knowable and that there are ways for man to know it. To fulfill our epistemological goal, then, we must make an ontological claim about the nature of the world, about reality, that it's present, there to be found, already given, out there somewhere separate from us, an independent, material, sensible, passive world available to our methods of discovery, waiting to be known. That assumption requires a realist ontology. So the epistemological project enables a methodological project that is always already an ontological project. Ontological realism is based on the subject-object binary that positions the human scientist as the subject, the knower, and the external, non-human, independent world as object, the known, waiting to be discovered by man's scientific methods. That world, reality, exists independent of thought and language. The work of language in this ontology is to represent reality clearly and precisely in text, to pull reality into words, to reduce the real to brute words that can be manipulated and analyzed like numbers. But Derrida wrote that language can't do that language can't capture and close off meaning. In other words, no matter how much we want it to, the world, reality, will always fail to capture being. Radically, Foucault argued that language is much more than representational. It actually produces the real. He wrote that discourse produces the object of which it speaks. So if man wants to know the world, he just writes a knowable world into existence. He invents, creates an ontology that aligns with his epistemology. His ontology then is a fiction. It's not real, but it becomes real as text after text repeats the unexamined, unquestioned fiction. Still, realism is just one theory of ontology, and as I noted in my September lecture, even physics, the hardest of the natural sciences, the science that really studies reality, is unclear about the nature of reality as one foundational law of physics after another fails. Anderson noted, reality isn't what it used to be, and as Baudrillard explained, never again will the real have to be produced. After all, reality is just a word that tries to capture everything that exists. Reality is an impossibility, always a fiction. But surely there's something out there separate from man, maybe not as separate as we've been told. It's Enlightenment's humanism's empirical science that argues for human exceptionalism, in which human being is so superior that it can be extracted and separated from the rest of being, be, and everything else. That epistemology also invented an ontology in which the subject-object, man-nature, know or known binaries can be thought and put to work. By now, it should be clear that methodology is the product of a particular onto-epistemological formation. For example, I would say that qualitative methodology is thinkable in epistemology's empiricism and in ontology's realism. More broadly, I would say that in the social sciences, epistemology is empirical, ontology is realist, and methodologies are prescriptive. So that's the structure I'm thinking against. But if with Judith Butler, we believe that the epistemological point of departure is inadequate, and if with Richard Rorty, we've developed a distrust of the whole epistemological enterprise, and if with Spivak, we know well the link between epistemic violence and the advancement of learning and civilization, and if we set epistemology aside for those reasons, what would happen? Well, that epistemological, ontological, methodological structure, that system of thought or image of thought would come undone and fall apart. Because if our goal is not to know the world, then we no longer need a knowable world, and we no longer need methods to produce knowledge about it. And this is why I have always argued that those who are interested in post-qualitative inquiry must first refuse methodology, must first try to forget it. Because if you begin in its structure, you accept its onto-epistemological assumptions that are incommensurable with post-structuralism. But without that structure to contain our thought and practice, we can think about existence, reality, being, ontology differently. We can live differently. If the world no longer exists for us and our knowledge project, perhaps it exists for itself. If we no longer have that Cartesian subject-object, man-nature, human, non-human binary, reality isn't governed by either or logic. If the world no longer has to exist, to be given, passive, and stable, so we know it, it can be active, self-forming, always in variation, always different, always becoming. And if the human cannot be extracted from the rest of being, then we are always already entangled in the world, always coming into being along with everything else. Furthermore, those prescriptive methodologies we invented for our epistemological project of knowing the real world are unthinkable, irrelevant, even nonsensical. By setting epistemology aside, we enable what Butler called an insurrection at the level of ontology. And ontology is up for grabs. When I think and write papers like this, and try to work with, and so must accommodate, ancient Western concepts and categories like epistemology and ontology, what Jameson called the prison house of language, I wonder what it would be like if we could erase and forget all the words in all our languages and start over. This would be a world without history. I wonder what we might be able to think and how we might be able to live. Would we invent a new world and new people, people that do not yet exist? Or would we begin again with dividing practices to sort ourselves and everything else that exists into another violent, dismal order of things? If we believe ontology is ethics, if we believe the description of the world is an ethical project and not an epistemological project, we could ask with Judith Butler, how might the world be remade? I stagger under the weight of those questions, even as I'm dazzled by their possibilities. I have no answers, but Foucault offered advice. He wrote, "We have to dig deeply to show how things have been historically contingent, for such and such reason, intelligible, but not necessary. We must make the intelligible appear against a backdrop of emptiness and deny its necessity. We must think that what exists is far from filling all possible spaces to make a truly unavoidable challenge of the question, what can be played? What might we think?" And that's it. That's the challenge. What can be played? What can be thought? If, as Derrida wrote, ontology is a conjuration, then we conjure, we summon the ontology we need. And it appears as if by magic, as if it has always been. In the Anthropocene, the brute, empiricist, realist ontology that grounds prescriptive social science research, that fiction invented to satisfy science's rage for knowledge, has become increasingly dangerous. But if we put our knowledge projects aside, what ontologies might we think and invent? If we had studied ontology, we know that philosophers, East and West, have been inventing different ontologies for centuries. I'm thinking here of indigenous philosophies, Eastern philosophers, as well as Western philosophers of eminence like Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, Whitehead, and Deleuze. I believe I noted in an earlier lecture that Deleuze seldom used the word epistemology in his work. Absent the epistemological rage for knowledge, thought can think differently, and Deleuze and Guattari invented a blast of concepts of immanence to help us reorient our thought so it's not focused on measuring and knowing and predicting and controlling. I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd lived an immanent ontology. I expect some of us always resisted the reality we inherited. Of course, immanence won't save us. It's not the cure, the fix. But I've studied too much Foucault not to ask his genealogical question about the history of the present. Why did Western thought choose realism over immanence when both were readily available? Whose power and interests were served as realism spread like a virus to infect the order of things? I don't think immanence is easy to think and live until it is. One has to read and study immanence and let its concepts do their work. I've written that I read Deleuze too soon, very early in my doctoral program. I surely didn't understand him then and still don't. Nonetheless, his and Guattari's concepts of immanence slipped into my sentences and into my days and laid down rhythms which soothed the normalized ontological violence I was accustomed to. Those concepts come to life when I'm startled by what one of our wonderful doctoral students, Nicole Sifrin, called an ontological breach, which is not recognized but sensed. When I'm startled by moments when the world kicks back, when the concrete richness of the sensible, released from methodological discipline, engenders a shock to thought, when realism's ontological rubble is put back into variation, immanence, always differentiating, always becoming. The world exceeds our thought, but new and different concepts can surely help us think a different world. As John Rockman wrote, we must make thinkable what we have not yet been able to think and make visible what we have been unable to discern clearly and distinctly. Rockman said such work requires a non-methodological rigor that doesn't rely on systematicity, objectivity, cause and effect, or progressive maturity. Rather, it proceeds by fits and starts, detours and returns, increasing complexity, and the creation of concepts that lay out different planes of thought and living. If ontology is a conjuration, we could conjure an ethical ontology, an affirmative ontology. To do that, we must believe in the world, in a world always, already, not here, and not yet, a world in continuous variation, immanent. To save ourselves, we must save the world because we do not pre-exist the world. We are not in the world, we become with the world. We need a new world and new modes of living. This ontological project, then, is an ethical project and an affirmative project that proclaims our belief in worlds to come. It is also a practical project we must get on with. So I ask, if ontology is a conjuration, what can be played? Thank you very much.
You're brilliant. Thank you. That was just lovely and brilliant and inspiring. Betty, how about you and Martin join the simulation of a back porch in the middle of a lecture room and the Miller Learning Center on the University of Georgia campus right here.
Martin is in charge of the microphone.
Right, I've got two roles right now, so be alongside Pastor St.Pierre, and also the mic person. Before we get into the porch talk, I think a couple things are in order. First of all, Betty, on behalf of everyone in the room and everyone on Zoom, I can't say much, just thank you. This was a tremendous lecture. There's so many points that I resonated with throughout your talk, and there's probably 40 different places I could start, but one of the things I'd like to hear you perhaps elaborate on, and I'll try to make this as clear as I can. I don't think it can be clear, but you made the point of we can teach method, but we can't teach thinking. So if we want others to participate in this worlding practice, if we want to create better, more ethical worlds, is there anything we can do? Is there ways that we can promote nomadism of thought to get people to think beyond the confines of humanism? Is there anything that we can do to create, and it's not the right word, but the word that comes to my mind is this idea of entry points. Are there fissures that we can create in humanism to open and expand and get people outside of the ignorance and see that there are things that we can think through? And so I know you've talked a lot about in previous lectures about this idea of reading deeply and widely. But to get people to that stage where they've made the commitment to read deeply and widely, before that, are there ways that we can create entry points? Or is that something that maybe it's a conceit for us to think that we can get others to think differently? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or I don't know if that was clear, but.
Well, I think this is maybe this is the problem of education in a way. I rely on my own experience as a doctoral student, and then of course working with doctoral students for 30 years and seeing some folks decide to try to think about everything differently and others not. And I know I've not been ready to think about a lot of things at different points in my life, and probably am not ready now to think about a lot of different things. So it's kind of, I think there has to be some desire or urge or something. You have to want something else, I think, before you're ready to just jump in and read something. When I started my doctoral program, I had had 2 careers already. I was done with that. I was bored. I was midlife. I really didn't want the rest of my life to look like what it did then. It was like, there's got to be more here. And, I trusted education. I trusted that if I went back to the university, there'd be something there for me. I mean, think about that you live your life trusting that if you go back to school, you'll get some good teachers. There's something about that that's just wonderful, isn't it? And I found those people, and they were feminists, and they were making the postmodern turn, and they had something I just wanted. I'd listen to them talk, the way they approached topics, the way they approached their students, their very serious reading practices. And I wanted that. And so that's what I wanted to do. I just knew. But I work with students who don't feel that way. And that's okay. I mean, I don't know when you're ready to make these moves, to make these shifts. But I think in our teaching, we can, require students to read certain things or do certain projects that we think will kind of put something in their way that might be an intervention in the way they're thinking or the normalized practices that we're all used to and are comfortable with. And in some sense, Martin, I think it's kind of like a crapshoot that you never know. You try to, Spivak said teaching is intervention, and I think about that a lot. Teaching is intervention. Well, I probably didn't learn that in a teaching methods course, but when is somebody ready to learn, ready to think differently? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong here. Again, that would create another artificial binary, but I had an experience recently where I was at another conference a couple weeks ago, and the session was hosted by a professor, and it was supposed to be on thinking and doing differently. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to this session. This is gonna be fun. But then as we were at roundtables, we started talking. If I can use a scale, like let's say 10 is very different and 0 is not different at all. People were talking at 1, 2, maybe 3. And then I said, okay, I'm gonna intervene here and see what happens. And I probably took the conversation to a 74. and that's what happened. I lost everyone at the table. Everyone was just like, Martin, like, what language are you talking? And so to going back to that, like, how do we create those entry points? Is I think we have to be attuned to who our audience is and attuned to the language and how far we can go and disturb their existence. And so I remember the same thing with students. I would tell them about the deconstruction of the subject, and we need to move away from the capital I, and perhaps what Karen Murris tells us to go to the I. And they would say, that's too much, Martin. You're gonna have to start with something simpler. So I think we've got a lot of work to do as educators to give those openings and doses and to make sure that the cognitive disjuncture is not too great, that these people fall back on the defensive and like, no, this is too much. I can't venture here, and I'm gonna fall back to my safety, my predictability of positivism. And so I don't know exactly. I've been struggling with this idea of entry points, and it's not the right word because we're always in the middle. Like there's never an entry point to these things. But yeah, I don't know where the conversation is going, but maybe if you know.
Yeah, I also think that this work has to be humble work, because people live their lives for particular reasons, and they've been trained in particular ways, and they begin to think and do things because it works for them in, wherever they are, what their discipline is, their family, their churches. And, my goal is usually to disrupt, because that's kind of what I'm interested in. But, is that fair? I think about that sometimes. Is it fair for me to do this? To pretend that I've got something great here and just do it, and you'll be great too. We'll all be great because we've all studied post-structuralism. Probably not. And there's so much out there to study and learn that I haven't found and you haven't found, and we don't even know exists. work that's been written that we don't even read, fields that are so far ahead that I can't think. I mean, I just think about, Martin sent me a wonderful paper about physics. And it's like the physicists are so far ahead of the social scientists in what they know about the world and reality. And we're just kind of chugging along here, reading a few books, and these books are startling, and just think about what else is out there. So people are doing great things everywhere. But I guess what really bothers me after years of teaching is how teaching can be so disciplinary. That teaching can be so structured and shut down rather than opening up. And I know I do that too. So I'm sure some of you have great ideas about this, and you do it beautifully in your work. So we're just talking about how do we get somebody maybe off the dime and thinking about life differently, but maybe they want to be on that dime too. You know, maybe that's where they want to live for a while. I don't know.
Yeah, the analogy, for those of you that are familiar with the movie, The Matrix, is when Morpheus is in front of Neo in the first movie and has the blue pill and the red pill. And says, do you want to take the red pill and then see what's behind the curtain? Or do you want to take the blue pill and just go back to the Matrix and nothing ever happened? And I give that analogy in my methods class. And a lot of students just look at me as like, just give me the blue pill. I can't. And so it's just an analogy. It's an imperfect one because it's not as easy as taking a pill. So, Betty talks all the time about that long preparation. And we have to recognize that not everyone is ready to engage in that long preparation. There's never going to be a destination where we're going to get to true understanding. And so that's a lot of work that some people may not just be willing or cannot undertake. And so we have to remain cognizant of that and remain humble again in our venture, our willing to disrupt. But sometimes there are places, times, spaces that maybe disruption is not the best thing. Stephanie, I don't know if there's any questions from the audience or otherwise.
I think we have one that it just came through. And
Can you use the microphone?
Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. There. If you're in the room and you have a question that you'd like to pose, you can put it on a piece of paper and slide it down to this row over here. So this question, I think, connects to what you were doing in the workshop this morning. And I think it absolutely connects to your conversation about education. So it's really about pedagogy. So in consideration of your work, what would posting pedagogy look like? Or would pedagogy be the art of inspiring deep reading and sensing? And can we have a pedagogy if not methodology? And it goes on and on. So really, I think it's an invitation to talk about pedagogy.
You want to start with this one? We just had this conversation before Betty's talk, and there's a recent paper that came out this summer on teaching post qualitatively, and I guess my position, and I'm sure other people see it differently, but I find it difficult, or I don't know if it's impossible to teach post qualitatively. We can teach students how to read within the post to get them inspired to read, and perhaps from that, the pedagogies that are what I discussed this morning, material performative, can flow from that. But that's sort of how I see it, and I'll let Betty chime in on that.
Well, some of you have been in my classes, so maybe you can answer this question. But I just think for me, it's about reading and talking and thinking and read a lot. talk to people about what you're reading. I encourage students to form reading groups, so you've got somebody to read with, especially if it's a really hard book. I think at some point, well, I think I don't really begin to learn something until I start writing about it. So if I'm invited to write a paper, I'll say, okay, this paper's got to be about empiricism because I don't know anything about empiricism. Or this paper has to be about immanence because I don't know enough about immanence. So I think at some point the reading comes in the writing, and then in the writing that is also learning. I'll end up writing a sentence and I don't know what it means or how it showed up on the page, but it's telling me something, and then I need to go read some more. So to me, this is just the basic scholarly work of reading, reading broadly, trying to read across disciplines maybe if you can and find time to do that, and then at some point just going deep somewhere, like just reading a scholar. I remember reading Foucault for a year. I mean, I was in heaven, fell in love with Foucault, obviously. So I really felt like I knew something, that I had kind of gotten somebody, but I don't think we value reading. It's always got to end up in hurry up and write the next paper or whatever. So I think it's that reading. I was talking with a friend who said, you know, Betty, he's also a Foucault addict. He said, you know, Betty, when I'm sick and I'm home and I'm, can't do anything, he said, I read Foucault's lectures. And I said, well, you are crazy. It's a reader for you. Reading Foucault's lectures when he's sick, that's his comfort. That's his, think about that. So anyway, so I think it's the reading and then talking with people, getting other people to help you think, doing some writing, whatever you need to do. But I also think, as I've said before, I think we too often ask our doc students to put aside everything they've learned in their other careers. Most of our doc students come to us with some expertise in other fields, and we just say, kind of put that aside and learn this. And I think they should definitely pull all of that into their work. So, but some of you have actually studied pedagogy. I mean, that's your job. So I'm sure hope some of you will email me and tell me what to do now.
Yeah, I think the word pedagogy is, the way at least most of us understand it, is loaded. So for me, pedagogy, if you look at it from a strictly conventional sense, is you've got a professor in front of a room that's just lecturing and you've got students listening. And to me, that unidirectional going back and forth is not how I see pedagogy. And I don't see it as well as a bidirectional. If everything is relational, then pedagogy is just something that flows. Again, I like to verbify a lot of nouns. Like when we noun something, it becomes crystallized. It becomes the static identity. But if we verbify everything, same thing with knowledge, just verbify knowledge. Knowledging becomes a flow. It flows everywhere. And so I try to do the same thing with pedagogy. And that's why this morning I was talking about a performative pedagogy through movement. And I think for me, when that happens, I can relinquish a lot of the pressures that come with being a pedagogue. That I have to make sure that you're all learning something to get that grade for you to move on and do other things in life. But if it's just a flow, then but I want to do that in a way where I'm challenging the students. And so this is not my term. I took this from Karen Murris, but a lot of people talk about being a facilitator of knowledge. But why do we need to make things easy? Why do we need to facilitate knowledge? I prefer, and I tell my students, I want to be a difficultator. I want to challenge you. I want to disrupt what you think you know. I want to disrupt who you think you are. And I think the posts allow us to do that. So we challenge everything that we take for granted. And to me, that's when we can start to talk about pedagogy. If we're doing those kind of things, then I think we're moving people, we're getting them to read. And as Betty would say, like everything you read will ontologically change you. And I think that's the flowing, moving process of pedagogy. in that constant striving for creating worlds and creating better versions of all of us.
Yeah, I was just thinking that when I started reading, it was post-structuralism that got me, that interested me a lot. And that helped me move out of wherever I was and really have a different life. But you can find this in any body of knowledge. I mean, it was post-structuralism for me, but other people read different philosophical approaches and find challenges and disruption there. So there's nothing magical about post-structuralism. Post-structuralism was this vibrant thing that happened in France, you know, coming out of World War II and the Algerian Revolution by some really smart French guys. And it appeals to me because it's kind of my generation. The thought is my generation. So I mean, I don't know what you want to read, but read something. Don't just read what you're assigned. Sample different philosophies. There's a lot out there we don't read. Post-qual comes from post-structuralism. Find something that intrigues you, challenges you, and you invent your own thing. You invent your own thing. Okay?
Okay.
To that point, I think you're spot on is, when I talk about these different concepts with students, I say, there's a disclaimer, I say, I'm not a preacher here, I'm not trying to preach these concepts and that this is the right way to do things. I just want to expose you to different ways to see how we can create worlds. And post-structuralism is definitely one way that's very enticing, but there are plenty of other ontologies there that we can just create, or ontologies that have been darkened because of the forces of humanism and positivism that we need to re-enlighten. And that's part of our work to do moving forward. And so I find myself constantly reading, and I make efforts to read in very wide, weird fields, because that's where I'm going to learn something. If I keep reading what I already know, then I'm not going to learn anything new. And so I keep trying to venture in different areas, and I try to get my students to venture in these areas with me as well. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But that's how I used the word nomadism of thought before. And we gotta continue to be nomads. As soon as we start to settle somewhere with our thought, we need to jolt ourselves out of that and keep moving. And I think that's part of the long preparation that we need to keep moving, keep flowing.
I don't really have anything else to say today, except happy to see you all here, and we all need to go home and read. Read texts that are too hard to read. If it's easy to read, why bother? If you understand it, why bother? Read something you don't understand and enjoy it. We're so lucky we can do this. So
I think we have a couple questions that have come in that if your questions weren't asked today or answered, we'd always love to pull those together and ask Betty to think about them for the next lecture. So I think this was really fabulous. And these conversations aren't, oh, do you need me to use this? And I suspect that these conversations are just beginning. I do want you to know that there is a small group of people getting together for dinner at Ted's Most Best in Athens. So if you're in the room and you'd like to join that group, that I'm sure the conversations around dinner will be terrific. But we look forward to seeing you all on January 13th. We have a big day tomorrow. I think that a lot of people who would have been here in person, some people even told me, that they weren't going to come today because they're busy canvassing and getting ready for lots of things that are happening today and tomorrow. And I just want to thank our international friends who are with us here in person and on Zoom. Thank you for being with us, holding space for all of us and being together today. And most of all, I want to say thank you to Martin and Betty, really, for a brilliant, really inspiring lecture today. And Martin, such great conversation this afternoon. So big round of applause for them. Welcome to hang out and chit chat. Come on up and talk.